and he spoke at his mother's funeral. And he had told me, I'm going to speak, but I don't know if I could do it. The only reason I think I could do it is because you did it when your mom passed. Well, I have two cousins here to thank. My cousin Glendale back there, when he lost his dear mom, his mom was special in our family. He preached her funeral. I had never seen that kind of strength before. And when my mother passed, Glendale, my cousin Ricardo, supported me at the service. He played, he sang, or tried to sing. Love you, cuz. It was just, it was wonderful. And that's how the blessings go. That if it wasn't for Glendale, one for Wakey, can I call you Wakey? I don't know if I could have stood up in Tabernacle Bible Church and spoke at my mother's funeral. And interestingly, and I get into this in my remarks tonight, I lost both of my parents in about a month. And there's a very special lady here who adopted me and all that hurt. Can you wave your hand, Mama Karen? You didn't have to pay me if you were telling me that Miss Karen was going to be here. I'm glad you did, and I'm keeping the check. But if you had told me she was going to be here, you wouldn't have had to pay me. I'll speak for about 25 minutes, and I'll be happy to take some questions. And my remarks tonight are called Only Just a Minute. I have only just a minute, only 60 seconds in it. Forced upon me, I can't refuse it. I didn't seek it, I didn't choose it, but it's up to me to use it. I must suffer if I lose it, give account if I abuse it. Just a tiny little minute, but eternity is in it. That brilliant little poem from Dr. Benjamin Mays, Dr. King's mentor, former president of Morehouse College in Atlanta, sent my mind plunging about time. For much of my adult life as a journalist, time stalked me in the form of deadlines. I can recall taking 41 credit hours during my senior year at KU, trying to get out on time. And I'm alternately thinking I have too much time and I'm bored, or I have too little time and I'm stressed. It's never just right. And until I started writing this speech, I had not realized how often time was a character in so many of the stories that I had written. Some of these are obvious. I can remember, for example, the paper running a story about a fight that turned into a deadly stabbing at a Wichita convenience store. The next week, I took a call from someone who said that they were at the scene and claimed that EMS workers stood across the street for several minutes before entering the convenience store to administer aid. And the loss of those precious minutes, the caller said, likely cost the stabbing victim her life. So I'm trying to verify this aspect of the story, end up talking to the chief of police, who explains to me that EMS workers typically will not enter a scene until police have secured it. And so the workers who were being frantically waved into the convenience store were just waiting for the police to give them the all clear. But what was most shocking about what happened was not the stabbing in the store. The chief said most of the shoppers shopped for several minutes before bothering to call police or EMS. The chief said that people actually stepped over this mortally wounded woman as she lay bleeding on the floor. One witness said that the flow of blood sounded like a water fountain. And I asked him how he knew all this. He said, it's on the surveillance camera. This is a line or two from that column that I wrote back in July of 2007. The video showed the 27-year-old woman struggling to her feet and collapsing 3 times before anyone helped her. Worse, One woman who had stepped over the woman 4 times while shopping eventually paused to take a picture of her with her cell phone. Those were the stories that affected me the most. The stories where people ran out of time. I wrote once about a man named Randy Taylor, a 47-year-old man who froze to death in the back of a parked van. Temperatures in Wichita that night had slid down into the teens. Neighbors said it wasn't uncommon for Randy to sleep in the van when he had nowhere else to go. The incident reminded me of a time when I was a child walking with my father in downtown Los Angeles. This is what I wrote in a 2005 column, quote, "I can remember holding tight to my father's arm as we navigated sleeping bodies on the sidewalk. These men seemed huge to me. They wore layers of soiled clothing. They reeked of alcohol as well as misery. They slept under newspapers and under rags, and I was afraid of them. Sensing that, my father shared a poem that I've never forgotten. I don't know the author. All I know is that it helped me begin to understand not simply the pain of homelessness, but also the cruel turns life can take. The poem read, some were paupers, some were kings, some were masters of their art, but in their shame, they were all the same, those men with broken hearts. And that's where my book title came from, a 1950s country and western song by Hank Williams titled Men with Broken Hearts. I wondered aloud in the column about what this horrible incident said about our society. We just seemed cool with people living this way and dying this way. Randy died on a night so cold, people brought their dogs inside. The coroner said that Randy died in part due to exposure. The freezing temperatures gave him only so much time. But there were also people for whom time rolled out like a vast desert that they were trying to cross. Time to them was heavy, was a burden. Time seemed to collapse on top of them like an avalanche. I sensed that it was like that for Benny Herring. I'd seen Benny around Wichita a few times. He always struck me as someone who was very polished, someone who exuded style. His hair, his clothes, his manner, all suggested cool. He worked at one of the aerospace companies in Wichita, and he made life's drudgery look good until he suffered through what was obviously a shattering layoff. This is what I wrote. Behold, life's treadmill. Work, then home, paycheck, bills. Work, then home, paycheck, bills. A modest pace, but terrible monotony. If you walk faster, it continues. If you walk slower, it continues. Was Benny Herring on such a treadmill? Did he fall off last December when he lost his job? Plodding along on the treadmill can seem difficult enough. It never stops, step after step. Eventually, what had started out as easy becomes laborious. But what happens when you fall? What happens when you lose your job? And then that question, that awful question, what am I going to do, begins to tickle your subconscious. Do you, as Kansas City police say Herring did, walk into a bank wearing a dark ski mask and camouflage pants? How could it be that this man, who most people described as elegant, refined, reflective, stood charged with staging a bizarre daylight bank robbery that was carried on CNN, by the way? How could this 44-year-old man with beloved pet birds chirping in his immaculate home be accused of holding a gun to someone's head, stripping hostages to their underwear, demanding a plane? There's an old saying that most men live lives of quiet desperation and die with the song still in them, songs they never had a chance or an opportunity to release. Benny seemed like one of those people to me. And then there were people like the late Muhammad Ali, who seemed to have squeezed 2 or 3 lifetimes into one lifetime. Ali had appeared at his niece's Louisville Elementary School, and when Ali arrived, the school had an impromptu all-school assembly. And at that assembly, Ali asked slowly, shadowboxing with his playful overbite, "Who's the baddest kid in the school?" And all the kids pointed at this one little boy, and Ali waved him down to the floor. And he started shadowboxing again. And having met the champ, what you may not have a sense for if you've only seen him on TV is he was 6'3". And his hands were huge. His hands were like Thanksgiving hams. I'm a grown man, and he did that with me, and I was like nervous because his hands were so big. Imagine what it was like for that child. Child starts crying, pushed past the champ, dove in his teacher's lap, and later, when the champ called the teacher to apologize and to see if the boy was all right, found out that the little boy had a birthday coming up that weekend. I got invited, and I got the exclusive story. Ali actually baked a cake for these boys. He did a magic show for them. He pulled coins out of their ears, pulled ribbons out of their ears, and he had this trick where he could push all of his body weight up on his big toe, and it made him look like he was levitating. But because his faith taught him that it was wrong to deceive anyone, he sat down and showed the kids how he did everything. It was a wonderful experience for them and for me. And as the boys were filing out, and as I prepared to leave, the champ grabbed my hand and said, "Assalamu alaikum," and brushed my cheek with his cheek. And I returned that with "Wa alaikum salam," and brushed his cheek. And he seemed stunned. He said, "Are you a Muslim, brother?" I was like, "No, but I know about the greeting." He said, "Wait right here," disappeared down a hallway. And he came back a few minutes later with a Quran and a Bible, and he spent the next hour trying to convert me. It was amazing. But finally I said, "I love you, champ. I absolutely love you, but you can't make me doubt it." And he smiled at me and he said, "That's okay." And then, violating all the rules of objectivity that I learned in journalism school, I started gushing about how important he was to me, how much he meant to me, how much courage he gave me in my own life. And then I turned and said I had to go. And he said, "Wait one more moment." He reached down into a box, pulled out 2 of his trading cards. He signed them. Then he placed them inside that folded sheet of handwritten Bible verses and gave it to me. Now, that was a cherished gift, but that wasn't the most special thing about that day. What was special about that day were the moments that he spent with me at his mother's dining room table, sharing the wonders of his faith with a complete stranger. So maybe you will hear it here first. One of our biggest mistakes in life is thinking that we have more time. And no one has proven more guilty of that than me, which is ironic. As I said before, I spent much of my adult life racing newsroom deadlines. Times like I spent with Ali are golden, but time is also like fire. If you use it correctly and responsibly, it's indispensable. Used without care, it can consume you. It was about this time of year back in 1995 where I flew home from Louisville for a visit, and when I arrived, I learned that my aunt, who lived with us and who helped raise me, was set to be released from the hospital. My mother asked if I wanted to come to the hospital to bring my aunt home, but my aunt never left. When we arrived, she was unresponsive. We were at her bedside hours later as she faded away. So my brief visit unfolded into planning a funeral, which was exhausting. At one point, I decided to go hear author Nathan McCall, a Washington Post reporter, deliver a speech at Wichita State. His book, Makes Me Want to Holler, had become a bestseller. And I loved the book. And during the question and answer, I got up, I asked a question that he complimented. And when I returned to my seat, I learned that I'd been sitting next to editors from the Wichita Eagle, and they offered me a job almost right there on the spot. And I eventually took the job here in this smaller market, not just for the pay. I got a $10,000 raise. And not just because I'd be working for a more traditional legacy news company. And I took the job despite the fact that the Louisville paper had promised me a stint at USA Today. But I took the job because every time I came home and visited my parents, they looked a little older. They were moving a little more slowly. And I felt a little bit more guilty about not being here to fetch and carry for them. And I spent the next 16 years doing just that, time that I cherished, because in April of 2011, they both passed away. My mother died April 6th, And I'd spent the previous evening watching her laugh at Archie Bunker on All in the Family so hard that she had tears coming out of her eyes and she covered her mouth. My father had said before that, because she'd been ill, said, if anything happens to Slim, which is what he called my mother, I won't be around much longer. And he wasn't. He died April 28th, 22 days after my mom. I got quality time with each of them, and each of them, sensing that their departure was imminent, actually took time to tell me how good of a son I'd been. I'm not sure I could have ever forgiven myself if I had stayed in Louisville, taken that smaller raise, stayed in that bigger market, worked at USA Today as they had promised. As great as that opportunity may have been, I knew that tomorrows were not promised, and neither are the tomorrows of our loved ones. It'd be a difficult lesson to learn. It's been difficult for me. I'd always intended to spend more time with my Uncle Sonny, my dad's last living sibling. But before I knew it, the pandemic was upon us. And shortly after he lost his wife, he learned that he had late-stage cancer. And he spent his last days out there in California with my cousins, visiting outside his ground floor window, talking to them on a cell phone. When we lose our seniors, it's like an entire library burning to the ground. We lose accumulated knowledge. We lose accumulated wisdom. Uncle Sonny and I weren't close, but I've just been sick about his passing ever since. It's like that old song, life is so brief and time is a thief when you're undecided. The time we spend with people is precious. In 2019, I had the opportunity to return to Louisville for a fellowship I was completing, and I got to catch up with my mentor, Larry Muhammad. Except for my dad and my brother and my two cousins who were here. Larry's just about the coolest dude I'd ever hung out with. When I met Larry, he was an example of what I wanted to be. He had this beautiful wife, he had this big house, he drove a Beamer, he was always dressed really nice, and he was a working journalist in a big market. On my visit to the paper, the editors asked Larry to take me out to dinner, and we eventually became friends. And I watched everything that he did. Larry was always trying to get published in magazines, in addition to his work at the paper. He was writing plays. He was constantly reading. He was a student of history. He was an incredible storyteller. And what I liked most was that he was polished and professional, but never in a way that you would forget that he was a proud Black man. I'll never forget the time in the newsroom where he was working on a story, and I could tell that the executive he was on the phone with kept saying that Larry's questions were stupid. And Larry eventually yelled, "Your mama's stupid," blam, and hung up the phone. This dude loved being a father so much that after his divorce, he wrote his kids every week and managed to slip a little bit of money into the envelope every week. He's the reason that I knew the greeting when I met Ali. He was in the Nation of Islam just like Ali, and he converted to mainstream Islam just like Ali. He was also one of the reasons I really wanted to be a good father. We would sneak cheeseburgers in the hoods of our hoodies into the movies, and after the movie was over, we'd go somewhere and sit and talk for hours. He poured himself into me and the other young Black men at the paper, and he also seemed to get a lot out of these interactions. I'm so grateful to him, still, and for him. Our investment in humanity is never wasted, never. My friend David Gilkey runs a program in Wichita for kids who are in gangs. And as he was launching it, I visited some of the young people in the program. I don't think I ever felt more old and intimidated than I did when I met those teenagers. They walked in, were sagging, they were all tatted up, faces twisted into frowns. I was still writing for the paper, and I wanted a sense for what their lives were like, what their circumstances were like. It looked like their lives had been very difficult. But as we sat down and I started talking, and I talked about my kids, about my experiences growing up, and I asked about them, and as I recognized their intelligence and their depth and their hurt, they started to resemble my own kids who were small then. By the time I stood to leave, they gathered around me and asked when I was coming back to see them. It was my first real encounter with something that I called in a later column father hunger. The young men just needed some male affirmation. They seemed desperate for it. They needed a man to invest in them the way Larry had invested in me. and the way the men in our family had invested in me was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. Now, there are days, and there are not many, when I feel like my time might be running out. A lot of my memories, which were once vivid, are beginning to blur, and that ebbing of time gives my work a greater sense of urgency. There are things that I don't want to leave unfinished, so I'm trying to power through them. I've written more speeches in the last 2 years, for example, than I have in the last 20. There are still some more books inside me that I'm trying to get out. I'd like to get to the African continent before too long. I want to write a screenplay. Black men tend not to live beyond 64, which means they pay into Social Security their entire lives, but die before receiving their first payment. Now, if that holds true, I have 10 years to reach the bottom of my creative bucket list. But as I've shared with you, tomorrow is not promised. So I'm encouraging you. This is for the students here. Approach your next day, month, year, decade, life with the same energy that I'm approaching my next day, month, year, decade, and life. Work hard, not to impress anyone, but work hard for yourself. Make sure you set short-term goals and long-term goals, and make sure you set those goals higher for yourself than anyone might set for you. Seek out the toughest advice, the hardest criticism, and embrace both as a path to success. And most important, learn to separate your feelings from that advice. Get comfortable hearing what you need to hear in order to improve and to grow. Understand that as a Black professional, there will be people harboring resentments about you. Just accept that as a given. There will be white people with pennies who don't want you to have a nickel, and there will be skin folk who ain't kinfolk. Try to maintain a close circle of friends with whom you can share some values and some professional experience. They'll help you decompress. They'll help you figure things out. They will inspire you, and they will keep you from giving up. They'll pay for themselves over and over again. Understand also that there's going to be people cheering for you, people like me. So do it, whatever it is, whatever investment in yourself, whatever goal you might have for yourself, just do it. Do it before it's too late, because you have only just a minute, only 60 seconds in it, forced upon you. You can't refuse it. You didn't seek it, you didn't choose it, but it's up to you to use it. You must suffer if you lose it. Give account if you abuse it. Just a tiny little minute, but your eternity is in it. Thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take any questions. I don't know if I can answer them, but I'd be happy to take the questions. Yes, ma'am. Well, I was forced into a lot of those transitions, I should mention. The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, we consider the Constitution our client. We fight on no fewer than 96 different fronts, from immigrant rights to police reform to First Amendment rights. And the organization has gone through so much change in the last 4 to 5 years that there's actually battles inside the organization. There's one group that wants us to focus more on First Amendment rights. And then there are other groups who want to see us fight more to change, police behavior, ending no-knock warrants, like the kind that killed the young man the other day. Right now in the state, we are fighting for voting rights. We are fighting for criminal justice reform, and specifically, we're trying to end juvenile fines and fees. We spoke to a judge who indicated that when he was on the bench, he's now retired, he was always waiving the fines, but the law indicated he had to assess the fees. But he was making the argument that a lot of the kids who appear before him are poor, and that their misdeeds are born out of that poverty. So it doesn't make sense to then heap all kinds of fines and fees, sometimes on kids who aren't even old enough to work. So I think we have their support there. But those are the three areas: criminal justice reform, law enforcement reform, and voting rights. We focus on three issues in our office where we spend 80% of our time, and then we hold open 20% for maybe whatever comes up. Like you may remember a few years ago, a man in Tonganoxie was moving into his house and got arrested. We represented that man. So we'll save 20% of our time to do those kinds of things. But to your point about how varied my career was, again, when I was in journalism school in the 80s, I had no idea that at some point I'd be running a museum. And I had no idea that I'd end up working for the ACLU. I just happened to have had a major that was pretty versatile. And that in the marketplace, people like journalists because we can work toward a deadline, we communicate pretty well, we build relationships, and those are all virtues in the corporate world. My brother, who is a corporate attorney, said that all of the people who finished at the top of his law school class were journalism undergrads, because law school is a lot of writing and research. So that's my plug for journalism, even though newspapers locally don't really exist anymore, which is why I'm here talking to you. Were you just giving me a thumbs up, or did you have a question?
I was scratching, but thumbs up too.
Super. Yes, sir. Well, that would have been one of our 20% cases. I was actually involved in one of those cases last year. In the legislature last year, really most years, a lot of mean legislation comes out. And we were finding ourselves playing defense a lot. And last session, there was legislation aimed at trans athletes. And there were only 5 trans athletes in the state. And we were trying to work against that bill. And I was actually on the phone messaging the last state senator who was the swing vote. He was literally on the floor, and I was texting him about, you really want to be on the right side of history here. And I swung that last vote. But we spend 80% of our time on those 3 cases, because really, if we took every case that came along, all of our efforts would be a mile wide and an inch deep, and we wouldn't make much progress. If we make progress on these 3 areas and we're successful, then the next time we can build on that. And pretty soon, you'll have the kind of authority like we kind of have now, where if we just send a threatening letter, people say, oh, well, they won their last big case. Maybe we ought to do what they say. And we've resolved several cases in the last year that way. But we did. That is one of the fronts we fight on. Yes, ma'am.
That you still apply in your life today?
What was that last part?
During the process of writing the book, is there something that you learned about yourself that you still apply in your life today?
I think I told someone this before the meeting. Oh, I'll tell my cousin. It wasn't my idea to do Some Were Paupers, Some Were Kings. A friend of mine has a publishing house, and she approached me about doing a book of my columns, and I thought, I only have like 5 good ones, 5 that I would put in a book. She was like, no, I think you're being really hard on yourself. There's probably 50 or 60. And I guess what has stayed with me since, because that book has been that publisher's most successful book ever. It's the only one that's turned a profit out of all the books that they've published. And it's allowed them to publish other books. And they're a publishing house that is trying to amplify progressive voices. But the thing that I could say is that I was just really hard on myself. As I said, I only thought I had 5 good columns, And I can tell you what they are in the book, but the response that people have had to the book has shown me that maybe you're being a little too tough on yourself. And that's why I was saying in the speech, when you set goals for yourself that are higher than others might have for you, you're always in a good place because you're going to clear everyone else's expectations of you. But the lesson to answer your question is maybe I shouldn't be as hard on myself as I am. But thank you for the question. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm curious if you would talk about, in terms of the book, a story that really had to go in, and one that most people talk about.
Most.
That you get a lot of feedback about in the book. There's a story that more than any other, that one, that's it.
Well, it depends. People tend to like my second favorite column. My second favorite column is about a woman who goes blind, and she's a pianist. And her husband helps her learn to play the piano after her blindness because she thought she'd lost it. And they were in their 70s, and she played everywhere in Wichita. She used to play at the art museum. There was a restaurant on Rock Road in Wichita called Quan Court. She used to play there. The Olive Tree. And you see this little couple, and she was holding onto his arm, and he had her purse, and they were just kind of walking around. They were just the cutest little couple. And the column is about her reconnecting with her long lost love, which is music. So there's a group of people who really like that one. The other one that really resonates is the first column in the book, where I'm writing satirically about my secret admirer, this lady who used to call me when I wasn't in the office and call me the N-word, affirmative action tar baby, all kinds of like horrible things, but it really resonated with people. Humor really seems, and I don't do that well. The Eagle had a columnist years ago named Bob Getz, and Bob was always funny, and I couldn't be funny more than maybe once a year. But that was one column that I thought was kind of funny because I was calling her honeysuckle and things like that, and sweetness, and talking facetiously about how she didn't want to disturb me, so she'd call when she knew I wasn't in the office. But those two are the ones that seem to resonate the most with people. Yeah. I did a audiobook, and I had to read all the columns. And the one that stopped me was the one I mentioned today about the man that died in the back of a van. And when I wrote it, it didn't affect me that way. But when I was reading it, I had to stop a few times because I started to cry. And I'm not sure why. The only story that ever made me cry when I was working at the Eagle was, some of you probably know Kay Monk Morgan. She had a little baby, and the baby, when she brought the baby home, the baby's coloring was off. And she thought that the baby might be jaundiced. But when she took the baby to the doctor, the baby had a hole in his heart. He was suffocating. He was blue because he was suffocating. He was 8 weeks old. And what typified that ailment was that he never cried. He just kind of whimpered. And she said there was a moment where he was about to go into surgery. They had to fly to Michigan. He was about to go into surgery, and they had a little board about this big they put the baby on. And they strapped his arms down. And Kay said when they strapped his arms down, he screamed. And she said she just burst into tears. And I was thinking about that, because I put that in the story. I was thinking about that driving home. I had to pull over and kind of compose myself. But that was the only time when I wrote that story about Randy in that van. I was angry. I wasn't hurt, just angry that someone could die like that and then just kind of be written off. But that was the one that affects me most. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for being here tonight, Mark. I've read your column for many years.
Thank you.
But one thing I would love to see you get angry about and do something about is civil forfeiture.
Oh, civil asset forfeiture?
I think it's growing. I think you're being discriminated, and it has to stop. People do not know what it is. When I was in the legislature, I helped Representative Gail Finney, and we came up with an amendment. It did not pass out of committee, but it's terrible what we're doing to people.
I would agree. Civil asset forfeiture was one of the issues we were focusing on when I joined the ACLU in 2018. And for those of you who don't know, it's essentially policing for profit. You could be driving down the street, you had a large sum of cash on you, the police could take it. You didn't have to be convicted, you didn't have to be charged, you didn't even have to be arrested. You could just take whatever you had on your person. And it strikes people as strange that you could lose your property without due process. And what's interesting is that there are a lot of people who are very conservative who also hate the idea of civil asset forfeiture for another set of reasons. So I actually wrote a piece with this Koch-backed group about civil asset forfeiture, and they signed it. They signed on to it. We ended up getting new leadership at our affiliate, and so we didn't follow up on civil asset forfeiture, although I saw in the paper yesterday or sometime this week that issue is back in the legislature. I agree. You shouldn't lose your property in this country without due process. And I think that's the bill that is being introduced, that you have to be convicted in order for the authorities to keep your property.
12 years ago,
Mhm. Yep.
They kept her money all these years, and just last year, Governor Finney went to down in the basement.
Yep, I remember that case. And then the officer who took it said something about, I'm gonna go get some barbecue. Oh. Yeah. It's interesting that in this age where we have so much access to information, information like that seems to miss everybody.
I don't know if this, okay, you know, I've known you all my life.
Sold you my first car.
Yes, you did. 1974.
And he's still
Maverick.
talking to me because it wasn't a good
It
car.
was a good car. Remember, it was gold, rusted top. Anyway, I knew you as a kid growing up, but I really got a chance to know you in college at the University of Kansas. Now, you talked about being a journalism major. Yes, you were a journalism major, but you were an advocate. Can you talk about that a little bit, if you could?
Oh, sure. I had joined the University Daily Kansan, which was a couple of classes. It was advanced reporting, advanced editing, and then the people who were the higher ups at the paper were actually paid to do those jobs. And one semester, I was working on the editorial board. So I helped write editorials for the organization. And there was an African-American woman on campus who was delivering pizzas. She delivered a pizza, or a bunch of pizzas, to a white fraternity house. They slapped the pizzas out of her hand, pushed her down, called her the N-word, the B-word, surrounded her. She thought she was about to get attacked, scrambled to her feet and got out. She called campus police. Campus police said, well, this happened off campus, so there's nothing we can do. The next call was to our house, to my house and my roommate, Corey. And Corey came in my room and said, oh man, these guys done slipped now. What are we gonna do? I said, let's go over there. It's like 10 o'clock at night. And have you guys seen Malcolm X? Remember when they were going to see about Brother Johnson? That's how we were walking across campus. We were walking across campus like we were going to see Brother Johnson. And by the time we got there were football players with us, people from the Lawrence community. We got out on that lawn, we lined up. We could see them looking out of the window. We went up to the door. I knocked on the door, and the guy kind of peeked out. And I said, we want some answers about what you did to Ann. Her name was Ann Dean. And the guy said, look, we're really sorry. We sent that guy upstairs. He can't come to the party tonight. And I said, is that it? Is that all you're gonna do? And just as I was saying that, there was a guy behind me who just went berserk. He reached over my shoulder, grabbed the guy's shirt and tried to pull him out the door. So his fraternity brothers are trying to pull him in. This guy's trying to pull him out. And just as that was happening, I heard someone say, they're breaking glass in the back of the building, back of the frat house. So I'm pinned between these two guys and I'm thinking, this has gotten out of hand quickly, kind of like what happened to Juwan Howard last night. So I get free and I turn around because time is moving like this. And I see a bunch of cruisers from the Lawrence Police Department. They have helmets on, face shields, and they all got out with their nightsticks and they were walking in a V toward us. The guy that had reached over my head, he took it to another level. He just went all the way off. So I asked someone to grab him and I walked over to the police with my hands up. And it was the chief or the sergeant or whoever was in control. And I said, I can clear this lawn without you guys having to hit anybody. He said, if you can do that, do it. He was really calm in the situation. So I managed to get everybody off the lawn and across the street. And where this happened on campus, there's a gate, to get onto campus, and there's a fountain. And this happened at a frat house across the street. But if you come back this way on the other side of the fountain, you're on school property. So I just had everybody move across the street onto the campus and sit there. So he comes by and says, you know what? I have to commend you. That was real leadership what you did. Now, all of you go home. Like, we don't have to go home. This is a protest and we can be on campus and we pay a lot of tuition here. So I'm not going home. He said, oh, is that right? So they just sat there and watched us watch the house, the SAE house. And so about 2 or 3 in the morning, me and Corey said, okay, well, we're gonna go home. Someone said, don't go home, Mark. There's a cruiser in front of your apartment. They're waiting on you. So I had to go hide out for the night. But it became this huge movement on campus. And the guy behind me who was going nuts became KU's first Black student body president in a generation. It tells you how far protests can go. But yeah, I just kind of got pulled into it, just like I got pulled into these other careers. Things happen, and then, in those moments you have to decide, you're gonna let this go, or should we say something? And we said, we're gonna do something. And it ended up really positive. That's a good question. You were there. You were there.
I know we're probably running out of time, but I have a big boy question. One,
I mean, are you trying to say his question wasn't a big?
I know. And now I'm coming back. I'm coming back to where he's going. Now, the funny thing about talking to the three of you, I can almost guess what you know. We've known each other a long time. I've learned some things about you I didn't know. But because we don't have the student body here that we need to have here today, one, I would love to have you back, and I would love to find a way to get them here. But since you are at the University of Kansas and you have some contact, and we all remember college, the difficulty we have with our students of color, so I'm going to specifically hit that one, is how we get them mobilized, motivated, because unlike going to school at KU, this is Butler Community College. I'm dealing with major issues without the necessary support?
That's a good question. Here's what I'd say. I remember someone telling me years ago that you can't lead people in Wichita. It's just something about who we are as Wichitans. You can't lead them. My addendum to that was, you may not be able to lead them, but people will follow. They'll reserve judgment. They want to see if you have a really good idea, but when it starts working, all of a sudden they're behind you like you're going to see Brother Johnson again. And I may have given you the wrong impression about the student movement at KU. We weren't part of the Black Student Union. The Black Student Union didn't want to do anything controversial. They were conflict averse. And we wanted to do everything confrontational. So we started our own organization. I didn't really like the name. The name of the organization was Black Men of Today. And I don't know who came up with that, but it still exists today. I was walking around on campus one day and I went by the office and I said, "Are you guys in BMOT?" He said, "Yeah, we're really proud of it." I didn't tell them that I was the person that started it, but we were a splinter group. And my cousins who really know the Bible know that a single stone set 1,000 birds aflight. If you have the right idea, the right leadership, you can motivate anyone. It's like that Simon Sinek video on leadership. People don't care what you do, they care why you do it. If your heart is in it, like Dr. King's heart was in stuff, like Malcolm X's heart was in stuff, people would follow. That's really the issue. You can't just kind of transplant inspiration into people cold. It's sort of like years ago, when I was working in Louisville, I interviewed the person who was the producer for Mr. Rogers, the children's television show. And she was making the point that the reason Mr. Rogers looked directly in the camera, he was trying to make eye contact with the kids who were watching the show. He was trying to create a connection, because once the kids know that you love them and respect them, then they'll listen and you can teach them. And I think leadership is the same way. You can't lead where you're not willing to go. And you can't lead anybody you don't love or a cause that you're not really behind. People will sense that. Like when we were, I was a mentor in a YMCA program called Black Achievers. And the kids could tell the adults who were there because they had what we used to call an MBO, a management by objective. There was like a checkbox and let's see, volunteering in the community. And then, I do this. The kids knew the people who were there for the MBO and then who was there for them. Kids will sniff that out. I think anybody's like that. Someone just shows up saying, "I'm here to lead you." They're like, "Yeah, go ahead." But I'd be happy to talk with you afterwards. And I'd be happy to meet with any student that you want to introduce me to. And we can start talking about it. Yes, sir. Why did I talk so long? Oh. I can't tell you how to spend that time. I can't tell you spend more time on your career and ignore your family. And I can't tell you to spend more time with your family and ignore your career. The point I was making about time, just use it wisely. Don't waste it. Regret is a terrible thing. And I feel like I've been really lucky in my career. I've got to do a lot of things, but I'm just barely 50 and I still have regrets. I regret not going to law school when I thought I would. I took the LSAT and I had a perfect score on the essay part. And I was just loving my career too much. Now, if I had been able to see into the future and see that the newspaper that I had joined that had 600 employees today barely exists, and I think the newsroom might have 4 reporters, I probably would have went ahead and gone to law school. But I don't think I wasted any time, but I do think that there were things that I regretted, and there are things that I did with my time where I had time and I didn't use it that I came to regret. It was the point I was trying to make in the piece where I was saying, you know, used wisely, it's invaluable. But if you waste it, it can be really bad. Just make sure that you're doing something productive. Find ways to divide your time between things that are important. But wasting time is just something that we can't do. Because as I said, you never know what's going to happen day to day. Did that help at all? Yes, ma'am. That's a great question. I don't think people understand what it is, to be perfectly honest. None of my kids had a civics class. I had civics in school. One of my favorite historians, Taylor Branch, says that history is the language of civics, that you can't be a good citizen unless you have a command of our history, right? Since we're not taking civics and we don't learn about the Constitution, people now think that the First Amendment applies only to them and what they want to say. And if you say something that I don't like, I get to silence you. I get to ban that book. I get to ban that language. Remember I was talking earlier about the internal fight at the ACLU? Well, there was a famous case where the ACLU represented neo-Nazis in Skokie, Illinois. I think it was like 1978. We also represented neo-Nazis in Charlottesville. And there were people inside our organization who just hated that idea. In fact, we passed a new rule that said before anyone in the legal department could represent neo-Nazis, they had to let everyone else know. I wasn't for that. When I was on campus at KU, one of the journalism professors invited the Missouri Knights of the Ku Klux Klan to the journalism school because he was wanting to teach his class how to cover extremists. And he did it during Black History Month. So that was like a big, PR calamity. So I don't think people understand what it is. And I remember being really confused and conflicted in college when that happened. Polk Auditorium is where Wilt Chamberlain used to play. There were 2,500 people inside listening to a panel that included the Missouri Knights of the Klan and my journalism professor, who was also a lawyer. So they were debating. And then outside, there were 2,500 people protesting. So I was outside for a while, then I went inside, and I came back outside. But today, I would vote for us to fight on behalf of the Nazis to say whatever they want to say. I'm not afraid of their ideas. I have better ideas. In fact, I really wish people would just put their ideas out on the table and let's debate it. But, this whole CRT thing, nobody wants to really talk about the issues. They want to whisper about it in the parking lot, but they don't want to put it on the table. But we have a lot of remedial work to do just to get people to understand who we are as a country, what the Constitution actually says. Here's a good one. So when we represent people who are immigrants, what most Americans don't understand is that our Constitution says persons, not citizens. That would shock a lot of people. who are chanting, build that wall. And the people who seem to proclaim that the most really seem to know the least about the Constitution. So I would be in favor of us making civics mandatory. There are people who are becoming citizens through the naturalization process who know more about our country than the people who claim to love it the most. But that's my best answer. I hope I answered your question. Yes, sir.
Public discourse. So if you come into a college setting like this and how do you get to have that conversation in a meaningful way? How would you educate students prepare to have this conversation when they encounter them in their future?
That's a great question. For years, I've been in favor of debates on big, important issues in our culture. In fact, that's really how I ended up at the ACLU. If you think back a few years, and there were all these incidents that involved police violence against communities. And what was most frustrating, I think, for most people is the lack of accountability when these things happen. So I had reached out to the DA in Wichita, Mark Bennett. I said, Mark, would you be willing to debate someone about these issues and how to do it? He said, sure. So then I reached out to this guy, Micah Kubik, who's the executive director of the ACLU. So would you be willing to debate Mark Bennett? And what I was trying to do was have a civic and civil debate, but I wanted it at my museum. And I wanted, TV cameras there to videotape it. But I wanted it to be high-level discussion, not this interpersonal, your mama, like Larry said, but something substantive, right? And Micah at the ACLU liked the idea so much, he offered me a job, and it never happened. But I don't know if you remember this, but Ted Cruz and Bernie Sanders had a debate, and I think it was about healthcare, and it was amazing. First of all, people may not like Ted Cruz, but in that debate, he was amazing. You get a sense for why he's as successful as he is. And Bernie was great too. But what I liked about it most was they just kind of sat down and debated all the points, and everyone in the audience learned. And that's what, instead of these reality shows where housewives are fighting and people are getting voted off islands, we should have those. You can go back and read the Lincoln Douglas debates and then compare it to the kinds of things that are being said today. You might not feel as good about Lincoln as a lot of people do if you read the Lincoln Douglas debates. So that kind of public discourse could lift everyone, because now, let me give you an example. So I'm gonna date myself here, but there was this incredible sports writer named Frank DeFord. Many of you remember Frank DeFord? He used to have a little story once a week on NPR. Anyway, he came to Wichita once, and he said, once upon a time in sports, the saying was, it doesn't matter if you win or lose, it's how you play the game. And then Vince Lombardi said, winning isn't everything, it's the only thing. He said, now today it's in your face. And that's our public discourse for you. I think we need to do things to be purposeful and intentional, and requiring people to have more than just opinions about things. That in a debate setting, you have to come with more than just an opinion. You have to have some supporting facts. It would just elevate our level of discourse away from, the kind of crap that you hear everywhere, from CNN to MSNBC to Fox. But I would love to see that happen more. That's a great question. Did I talk you out?
Let's give Mark a round of applause, please. For those of you who heard his story about me doing my mother's eulogy, that was not our first preaching experience. I was baptized in a Maverick on the way to North High. And every time my teacher would ask me something, I would always tell the teacher, let me get with Mark and I'll get back with you. So I love him with everything that I have. What you see with him is what you get with him. I have known him all my life, because I will tell you that there isn't too many people that I will stand and speak boldly. Most people up here think that I'm fat. I'm not fat. I'm full of pride right now. So when he goes home, this vest will go down. So I love you guys. But I want the whole student government to stand on your feet, please, because I want to acknowledge these people. They do an outstanding job. That's including BSA, that's including everybody. Please stand. You guys are our future. You guys are the next presenters. So the only thing that I can tell you is to stay strong. John Maxwell said it best in his book, and Mark said it best on stage. People don't want to know how much you know until they see how much you care. And hopefully everybody in this room has showed you guys what you mean to them. You can go ahead and take a seat. Dr. Krohn, I know you are here. Would you like to say anything?
I would just say thank you from all at Butler for words tonight. Were impactful to me personally, and I think everybody in the room. And we appreciate your message and all you're doing to make our world a better place.
Oh.
We all need to do that. We all need that personal responsibility. But standing here or sitting here, needing to hear your message tonight makes it even more important for us. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Alicia?
Thank you from the bottom of my heart. So gracious. We know each other back and forth, and because of you tonight, I'm officially a fan. And he's a mentor along with Carla.
You got a good one. Carla's really a treasure. We should give her a hand.
So everybody know who you are, please.
Yeah!
I'll just say, I recognize the distinctive voice. That's
Yes.
how I made her out.
I was baptized with him and I was preached with my cousin Ricardo. I will tell you, they're both men of God, and I would like to thank everybody here coming out, taking time out of your schedule, especially my hero. I know he don't like me calling him out, but he know who he is. And I just want to say thank you. We have refreshments in the back, and we will have the last remarks from Mark.
I have remarked. I am Mark, and I have remarked.
With that being said, I think Alicia is going to pass the plate for Pastor Mark. No.
You are free to go. I would like to see BSA and SGA for a photo op before you leave. Thank you all so much. Butler Foundation, Harold Smith Cultural Series, thank you so much. One more time for Mark McCormick. Y'all want some more?